Hello and welcome to the webinar, Identifying Leaders in Carbon Capture, Partnering for Success. My name is Chris Robinson, Senior Director here at Lux, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today are my colleagues Thomas Briggs, Senior Research Associate, and Urvi Mehta, Senior Research Associate here at Lux. Throughout the webinar, type any questions you have into the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. If your question doesn't get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll make sure to respond. And lastly, if at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check your internet connection to make sure it's strong. And with that, we'll jump right into the presentation. Over to you, Thomas and Urvi.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm Thomas Briggs. I'm a Senior Research Associate here at Lux. Very excited to be here today talking with you about one of my core topics being carbon capture. So I work on our energy team, and I'm joined by my colleague Urvi Mehta as well.
Thanks, Thomas. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure you all can join us today. As everybody said, I am Urvi, and I'm a Senior Research Associate, but I mainly concentrate on the utility side. That will be helpful later, but let's start. Over the past decade, carbon capture has transformed from a niche climate concept into a cornerstone of global decarbonization strategies. As we explore the world of carbon capture, we will go beyond today with usual focus of heavy industries. Take a closer look at the innovation landscape, particularly the role of their startups and their technology, through the lens of our exclusive Lux Innovation Grid. From there, we will also like to evaluate the current state of carbon capture solutions, mainly into natural gas, and explore how these technologies are expanding into new frontiers, like data centers. We will understand how we identify breakthrough developments and strategic shifts shaping the first fast evolving market, not only for today, but for years to come. As I mentioned before, I am the utility person. So for today's presentation, I will be wearing a proverbial hat of a project manager who is interested in carbon solutions, mainly to explore the solutions and use it for its own needs. Now, as I have been aware in the past, carbon capture has been tagged as a key solution to decarbonize many industries, heavy duty industries, especially like cement, steel, and chemicals. But if we look at this list, you will notice there is a power generation. As a utility person, mostly power generation mindset was such that we convert it into 100% renewables to make it to remove carbon from it. But that essentially is not true. We look at the IEA data, which was released recently. It is not possible to convert it into 100% renewables, at least for the near future. So what is the next best solution, you ask? Natural gas. It has been deemed that natural gas is one of the best alternatives, with 50% fewer carbon emissions than other fossil fuels. That brings me back to the slides. Now we know that why we are concentrating on power generation as a market for carbon capture. But we want to go a step further and look into the data centers. Though in traditional sense, data centers are not carbon emitters, but they are heavy electricity users. And in the US alone, data centers are expected to cross more than 400 terawatt hour of electricity consumption, leading to 200 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions by 2028. Our analysis indicate that natural gas with carbon capture makes the most sense for data centers. As a project manager interested in installing carbon solutions, this is a super exciting business opportunity. And it seems that companies are already jumping into this. If you look at the oil and gas providers like Exxon, Chevron, they have specific plans to deploy this kind of technology. I want to embrace this opportunity as well. And from my experience, if I were to think about the technology, there is already a solution out there when I look at the announcements from different companies in terms of mainly amine solvent projects like Honeywell, Siemens, etc. Easy answer. I can call one of this company, I can partner with them, and I can work with them to set up my project, right, Thomas? I think that's it. That's my solution. Thank you, everyone.
Well, unfortunately, Urvi, it's not quite that simple. So we looked at before the different industries, and I think it's important to note that not all of these industries, not all of these flue gases are really created equal. So, specifically in natural gas turbines, we actually see a much lower CO2 concentration. Now, it varies somewhere between 4 and 5%. And we also see a much higher oxygen content compared to those heavy industries like cement and steel, which have really traditionally gotten a lot of the funding and the pilot projects. So, even just outside of this natural gas question, while the incumbent amine solvent technology has been really widely validated and deployed, it does have some weaknesses. So, amines have a high energy consumption. They're corrosive. They can degrade in the presence of oxygen, resulting in some loss, lower effectiveness. They require water. So, while it is a ready solution today, it may not be the optimal option. Now, in order to get a better understanding of the full scope of opportunity, we really need to evaluate the innovation landscape.
I know about the innovation. We have technologies other than solvents. There are solvents which are solid mediums, then there are membranes that selectively separate carbon dioxide from flue gases, a cryogenic method to separate carbon dioxide through physical cooling, and there is an electroswing which uses electrochemical platform to separate carbon dioxide. This has led to a wide startup landscape seeking to address challenges you mentioned with amine solvents and make carbon capture efficient. But the challenge still stands. How do I determine which technology surpasses the established options or which startup to go with? What key factors should I take into consideration when I'm evaluating these startups? Or should we continue with what is already established? Overall, if I have to say, how am I supposed to make this sense of this innovation landscape and determine if any companies can suit my needs?
Well, that's a great question. It's really at the heart of what we do. So, in order to answer that, I'm going to ask Irvi, the carbon project manager, to leave us for a second, and Irvi, the Lux research analyst, to come back and tell us how we categorize and view innovation. So, thank you, Irvi, and welcome back, Irvi.
Thanks, Thomas. So now, as we know, we are talking about innovation. Innovation is a our bread and butter at Lux. And we ask ourselves this big questions not only for this technology, but to analyze the market overall for all the technologies out there. And this has led us to a Lux Innovation Grid. It is inherently a mapping system that is divided into four quadrants, designed to evaluate companies' overall standing. It's built into two key dimensions, business execution and technology value. A company's position is determined by how it performs across the two dimensions. The SAGE standing is supported by a set of sub-parameters that provide a deeper, more nuanced assessment of company strength and opportunities. So, let's start from the technical value side. There are four major parameters. The first is the solution value that considers key performance metrics like energy consumption, operating temperature, and carbon dioxide recovery rates for carbon capture technology. Next is the measure of the IP position, which primarily evaluates the patent coverage. Following that, we look into companies' addressable market size. What I mean by that is, what is the company's capability to capture the size of the market? And what market competition is out there is covered into the competitive landscape. This allows us to analyze the company's technology nuances and standing overall. Please note that all these factors are not equally important. Hence, we have assigned a weighted scoring method, meaning that solution value, being one of the most important, has a 50% weightage, while others would have a lower weightage depending on their influence. Moving on to the business execution side, similar weighted scoring applies. Here, there are six critical pointers that we take into the consideration, starting with the partnerships. Specifically, how strong the startup partners are, and how will they assist startups in commercializing their technology. The next step is the momentum. It is how rapidly a company moves, gaining partners, funding, grants, and it's expanding its capabilities. The next is the barriers to growth and scale. Barriers to growth are about how formidable the startup will face future obstacles, while scale is that what size the company is currently at, mainly is it at the pilot stage, is it at the introduction stage, etc. Next comes the management team that sets the organization's strength metrics and lastly the regulatory factors, especially the incentives which will set the timeline for adopting carbon capture technology. As mentioned, this strategy and framework can be employed across all technology fields, not just carbon capture. Like currently, I'm working on a long duration energy storage. Now, your question should be how do we collect this data? How do we know all this about the companies? We do research known as an innovator assessment, where we talk to companies, technology, and market expert for almost an hour, and also conduct an in-depth into their business history as well as into the technology dynamics. Also going through their patents, which provide us with the capability to evaluate these companies and score the company. Having said that, I will take a step back into my project management role. For carbon capture, we analyzed more than 30 plus startups across all these parameters, which led us to this grid. Whoa, I know this is intimidating. It is for me as well. But what, Thomas, if I need a tailored solution for natural gas from this grid, how we will build that understanding and draw conclusion for the startups?
Well, we have to do just a little bit more work. So, if we want to filter out specific applications, I think it's really important to understand where and how companies are deploying. Now, in order to do this, we developed a concentration applicability filtering tool as part of the research process for this report. So, we did this through essentially looking at what the startups are saying themselves, getting the information straight from them. So, looking at claimed capabilities, this means a company publicly stating something like our solvent is suitable for CO2 ranges from 3% to 25%. Or a company stating that it can be applied to industries like cement, waste to energy, steel, with each of these industries having their own CO2 concentration ranges associated with its flue gas source. So, looking at one, those claims, and then two, looking at where each startup had an actual deployment, a test, a pilot, or a really actionable near-term deployment plan for a specific industry or concentration, right? And so visually, just looking at this, a claim is indicated by a hollow circle, and a deployment is indicated by a filled-in circle, right? So we take this methodology, we apply it across our whole startup landscape, and then we can see which companies are attempting to address the below 5% concentration range.
Yeah, that makes sense. So earlier we talked about how my competitors are already targeting data centers, but I need a validated technology. How we do that, Thomas?
Well, we just filter a little farther. We filter away from just the claim startups, and then we look at the startups who have actual deployments. And I think this shows some really interesting trends here. One, the most mature startups, the ones who are really deploying their technology, are solvent providers. Companies like Ion Clean Energy, KC8, Entropy, they've all tested their technology, while Carbon Clean, Acre have really near-term plans or feed studies specifically for this natural gas carbon capture application. Now, we can compare the performance of some of these solvents with our incumbents, specifically MEA from the corporate side of things. So let's take someone like Ion Clean Energy. Now, they offer a non-aqueous amine solvent composition that it claims utilizes 2.6 to 2.7 gigajoules per ton of CO2. Now, that's a pretty big reduction compared to your standard MEA requiring 3.4 to 3.8 to 4 gigajoules per ton of CO2. And they also claim to have addressed some of those challenges that the standard amine solvents face. So Ion Clean Energy claims that they've reduced water consumption. Their solvent has enhanced stability, reducing degradation. So, each of these providers offers something a little different, but we can largely view these as stepwise improvements on incumbent amines. These innovators, they've addressed these standard challenges, yielding improved solvent compositions. And I think it's important to acknowledge that startups aren't the only ones who are active in this type of innovation. We also see next generation developments from the corporate players. So, one example being someone like MHI with its KS1 to KS21 solvent.
Yeah. So, Thomas, I can see that the innovation is addressing a lot of traditional solvent challenges. But what else is out there? What about the rest of the landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of very exciting early stage innovation out there. So let's just open that aperture back up a little bit to the startups who are making claims, maybe some of the startups who are earlier in the pilot stage. And I think we see a few interesting themes when we look at all of these startups, right? Now, whereas a lot of the more advanced commercializing startups are focused on improved solvent performances and compositions, a lot of the early stage companies are really introducing fundamental process changes. So the technology at its core just operates differently than a standard thermochemical solvent absorption desorption process. Now, the new processes offer, in many cases, dramatically reduced energy consumption. And in some cases, we actually see companies really specifically tailoring their solution to low concentrations or more things like high temperature assets. So this, I think, is really particularly evident when we look at the companies who are targeting low concentrations in the high potential quadrant of this innovation grid. And we can pick out, I think, several startups that fit these categories. So one example of a fundamental process change, I think, or a good example is Mantle, which develops a molten borate system. And they claim that they can improve overall carbon capture process efficiency by yielding high-grade waste heat as a product of their reaction. So they take some of their host industrial facilities' heat, use it in their capture process, and then yield high-grade waste heat as a product of that capture process, which can then be reintegrated back into the host industrial facility. So by operating at extremely high temperatures, they make their waste product more usable by the host facility and claim they can reduce this parasitic energy consumption really far, down to 0.1 to 1.2 gigajoules per ton of CO2. Now, an example of a company who is maybe tailoring to natural gas is Mitico. And they develop a solid carbonate sorbent that, they're claiming to address a really wide concentration, 4% to 20%. But when, from our conversations with them, looking at their partnerships with their planned deployments, they're really focused on this natural gas application. And so their sorbent itself, it's a solid carbonate. And they also add some water that they claim helps improve reaction kinetics. They claim that this solid process can bring energy consumption down to 1.2 gigajoules per ton without waste heat recovery, and really more rapid reaction kinetics than something like a solvent carbonate process. And I think a common theme amongst all of these is that energy consumption reduction claim. So we also see Captivate, a metal organic framework company as well. They claim that through the use of their novel sorbent, they can reduce energy even further down to 1.5 gigajoules per ton. Again, all of these are really dramatic improvements, 1.2, 1.2, 1.5 on MEAs, 3.4 gigajoules per ton. And now I think another key thing to note here is that a lot of these companies either haven't piloted or have low-scale pilots coming in the next few years. So the timeline for commercialization for these technologies is a little bit longer. We just moved pretty quickly through a lot of this innovation, dug pretty deep. So take a second here, circle back. Really, what does all this innovation mean? What does this mean for you, and what does this mean for data centers?
So, Thomas, let me see if I understand this correctly and what all this means. Not all technology is applicable to natural gas carbon capture. And if I really want to embrace the quickness of this data center opportunity, I will still likely be partnering with a solvent provider, whether it's a corporate or a startup. Is my understanding correct?
Yeah, Irvi, I think that's accurate. These solvent providers are really the ones who are scaling capacity and can address needs now. But I think it's important when you're looking at this solution, maybe a well-rounded, a portfolio approach here. will really help you capture all those technologies that are applicable not only in the near term, but also those technologies who have longer term, longer developmental horizons. So that makes sure you're not left out of some of these more dramatic potential performance improvements. And I think that's important, not just for the specifics of the data center opportunity, where there's a lot of urgency, but also for natural gas power as a whole. Now, the world is having a lot of difficulties getting renewables on the grid as quickly as we would like. So really, we could see an increased importance of natural gas as a low carbon power source combined with CCUS to expand the deployment, the opportunity outside of just data centers and into the grid and into grid reliability as a whole. So, at the end of the day, we really do need reliable, low carbon power. And I think, lastly, I'd like to point out that the grid isn't static. It's just a snapshot in time. So the innovation landscape continually changes, it shifts. The positions aren't fixed. But what does this mean for you, Urvi, the carbon project manager, but also for our audience today? What can they really do? And I think the first, and we didn't really have time to discuss this today, but you really need to consider all of these technology developments. You really need to consider deploying this technology in the context of the broader CCUS infrastructure. So transportation, sequestration facilities. Carbon capture, the carbon capture technology itself is only one part of the offering. So when you evaluate deploying these technologies, you really need to take into account where are you going to transport, where are you going to sequester it, what are you going to do with the carbon. I think the second is increasing the importance or focus on natural gas carbon capture as a business opportunity. Now, really, in my view, this hasn't been a focus for a lot of technology providers. They really have been focused on these heavy industries, cement and steel. But given the emergence of data centers, the difficulties with other power generation opportunities, we see this as really an emerging opportunity. So expanding your partnerships, both with technology providers as well as some of the companies developing the power equipment, sets the groundwork to enter this business here. And third, I think it's really important to understand the innovation landscape. And a great way to do that is to use these tools we've shown today. Not just the grid, the primary research profiles, our insights. They help build your foundational understanding of innovation. And this is relevant not just for natural gas, but for other kinds of carbon capture opportunities and other innovation spaces very broadly. It's a full-time job. And here at Lux, we update our reports really frequently. We have ongoing conversations with startups, and we're always monitoring the news to stay up to date for these new technologies, new developments. And, this helps you continually update your technology strategy. And it's a shifting landscape. These companies can expand their capabilities. So we looked at companies today who are currently looking to address low concentrations. But new companies can begin to develop partnerships, deploy pilots to address lower concentrations. New companies, new technology types can enter the market. So it's really critical to be flexible here and adapt to the new offerings as this market continues to develop. And that brings us to the end of our presentation today. So with that, I think we'd like to say thank you so much for taking the time and tuning into this webinar.
Excellent. And thank you, Thomas and Urvi. We'll now be taking questions you might have in the presentation. And as a reminder, you can drop those into the questions box on your screen. And if we don't get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So I'll bring up the questions here. This one here, I think you touched upon, but maybe we could expand upon. Are there other kinds of carbon capture technologies within this future category outside of just the sorbent developers, Mantel and Midico?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think going back to that grid, you see some new membrane technology developers really applying their technology to natural gas. Aqualung, they develop a facilitated transport membrane that's really a fundamentally different type of membrane than the standard polymeric membranes. We view that as having a lot of technology advantages. We touched a little bit upon Captivate, who are developing metal organic frameworks, but there's also a few other startups, Fonte being one of the major ones, but also Decarbon, who are looking to deploy and develop metal organic frameworks for this application. So there are certainly a few different other technology types out there, aside from just mantle and Mitico.
Got it. And then this one's a bit more on methodologies, and Urvi, maybe I'll pose this one to you, as I know we're thinking about other technologies for the innovation grid. But so you mentioned you can apply this innovation grid across technologies. So how does the methodology change between different technologies?
Thank you, Chris. So the base of the methodology remains the same. But when we take into the considerations about how we rate or how we score any startup based on those bases, that changes. So for example, let's go back at the solution value. For carbon capture itself, we will take into consideration efficiency, energy consumption, etc., when we score for the solution value. While when we have to think about something like the energy storage, for example, long duration, we will think about the efficiency as well as we will think about the cycle life, about the critical minerals, etc. So in such a form, internal consideration changes, but the overall basic outline remains the same.
Understood. And then I think we got time for one last question here. Kind of moving the opposite direction, Thomas, thinking about solvents. What are the other kinds of new solvents that we see startups developing outside of non-aqueous amines?
Yeah, I think there's two different angles or approaches there, right? There's the innovation within the amine category and the innovation outside of amines, so the non-amine solvents. For the non-amine solvents, there's things like potassium carbonate solvents. KC8 develops those. Enzymatic solvents, that's more corporate. And then within the amines themselves, there are a few different approaches, right? So non-aqueous, we looked at with ion clean energy, biphasic amines, secondary, tertiary amines, new amine blends. There's quite a few different approaches in there, and really they all do seek to address those core fundamental questions of reduced energy consumption, reduced water, improved stability. But there's an enormous diversity of different mechanisms within each of those categories.
All right. Thank you very much, Thomas and Urvi. That concludes our webinar for today. As a reminder, the slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent out to all attendees via email later today. And after you leave the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey in today's presentation. We do appreciate any feedback you might have. It helps inform and improve future webinars. So take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars. Lastly, thank you for joining us and have a great day.